The courtroom was silent, tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. A young black boy sat nervously at the witness stand, his small body trembling with fear. He had been through more in his short life than most people could ever imagine, but today was different. Today, everything he had been running from would come to light. The judge, a white man with a stern expression, looked down at the boy, his voice cold as he asked, "How do you feel about the family wishing to adopt you?" The room held its breath. The boy hesitated, his eyes darting nervously to the family seated across the room, well-dressed, smiling, but their eyes full of something darker. He knew their smiles were fake, that their intentions were not pure. He had felt it every time they looked at him, the way they spoke to him, as if he was nothing more than a tool to be used. He wanted to scream, to tell everyone what they were really doing, but he was terrified. Then, without thinking, he whispered just one word, but it would change everything. "They beat me." The room went deathly silent. The judge's face turned pale, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the phone. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The tension that had been building exploded as the judge immediately dialed 911. The truth had been spoken, and it was more than anyone had expected. What happened next will shock you. How did this simple word shatter the facade of a perfect family? And what will happen when the truth is exposed? We want to hear from you. Leave your name and where you're watching from in the comments below. You are incredibly important to us, and your support means the world. Every comment, like, and share helps us grow and keeps our community strong. You truly make a difference, and we can't thank you enough for being part of our journey. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that made your skin prickle with unease. The air was heavy with tension as the door creaked open, and the young black boy, no older than 10, shuffled nervously into the room. His wide eyes scanned the space, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, the polished wood, the glaring lights, the silent, judging faces. This was it. The moment that would determine his fate. He had never been in a courtroom before, and the weight of the moment pressed down on his small shoulders. His clothes were too big, his shoes too worn, but there he was, standing in front of a judge who held his future in his hands. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest, a sound that drowned out the hum of the room. His palms were sweaty, his throat dry. The judge, a white man in his mid-50s with thinning hair and a serious expression, looked down at the boy from his high podium. His robe flowed around him like a dark cloud, and his stern eyes flickered over the boy without much emotion. He shuffled some papers, cleared his throat, and then addressed the room. "All right, let's get started," the judge said, his voice deep and official. He glanced at the boy and then at the family seated across the room. The white couple, their faces neatly composed, looked at the boy with forced smiles. Their clothes were immaculate, their faces too perfect. They had been trying for months to adopt a child, and today seemed like their moment. But the boy, he didn't feel the excitement that they projected. He felt the weight of their gaze, the discomfort that came with the smile that didn't reach their eyes. They were strangers to him, and the boy had learned long ago to be wary of strangers. Especially those who wanted something from him. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "Now, name of the boy, you're here today because this family wishes to adopt you. The court has reviewed your case, and we're here to see if this is in your best interest." He glanced down at the paperwork again, but his eyes remained fixed on the boy. The boy shifted uncomfortably on the stand, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't know how to express. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. What if they didn't believe him? What if they didn't listen? His hands clenched, and he felt his breath catch in his chest. The white couple's lawyer smiled warmly at the boy from across the room. "This family is eager to provide you with a loving home," the lawyer said, his voice sweet and practiced, like he had said this same line 100 times before. "They will give you everything you need: safety, security, love." The boy's stomach twisted. He had heard those words before. They were always the same. But no one had ever really asked him what he wanted. No one had ever cared about what he needed, what he feared. All that mattered now was the decision the judge would make. The judge's gaze turned back to the boy, and the boy felt a shiver run down his spine. The judge cleared his throat again and asked the question that everyone was waiting for. "How do you feel about this family adopting you, name of the boy?" And that's when everything changed. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but the words were harder than he thought. He had never shared his feelings with anyone, not like this. His throat tightened, and he looked down at the floor, his eyes welling up. There were so many things he wanted to say. The fear. The confusion. The uncertainty. But there was one word, just one, that had to be said. It was the word that had been haunting him, the word that he could never escape. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the judge's, and then, softly, almost inaudibly, he spoke. "They beat me." The room went silent. The judge's pen froze midair, and for a long moment there was nothing but the weight of that single word hanging in the air. The boy's words echoed in the courtroom, cutting through the stillness like a knife. As the boy's words echoed through the silence of the courtroom, all eyes turned to the couple seated across the room. The smiles on their faces, once carefully placed and seemingly genuine, now faltered, though only for a brief moment. They quickly composed themselves, maintaining their polished exterior as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, there was something unsettling in their demeanor, something the boy could feel even though he couldn't fully understand it. The man, tall with neatly combed hair and a perfectly tailored suit, sat with his hands clasped in front of him. His gaze never wavered from the boy, a controlled look of calmness, yet his eyes, too sharp, too calculating, betrayed something darker. His wife, beside him, wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was neatly dressed in a pearl necklace and a conservative dress, the picture of the loving, well-off mother that the court wanted to see. But the way her eyes lingered on the boy, the way her fingers fidgeted with her jewelry, revealed an unsettling undercurrent. The boy could feel their eyes on him, a weight pressing on him as if they were sizing him up, calculating his worth. He had seen that look before, whenever he was brought into another foster home or placed with a family that didn't really care about him, but about the financial benefits they could get. He had seen how people treated him as a commodity, something to be owned and controlled, not someone to love or care for. The adoptive father, Mr. Gregory, straightened in his chair and cleared his throat, trying to draw attention away from the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, "we understand that this process is about what is best for the child, and we're fully committed to giving him the life he deserves." His words sounded rehearsed, like he had said them 1,000 times before in other courtrooms, other adoption hearings. But the boy saw through it. The polished words, the fake kindness, they were all a mask for what was really behind their intentions. He didn't know how, but he could feel it. They didn't care about him. They didn't care about his safety or his happiness. They were here for one thing and one thing only, money. The adoptive mother, Mrs. Gregory, leaned forward slightly, her voice sweet and patronizing. "We've been waiting for so long for the right child to come into our lives," she said, casting a brief glance at her husband, as if they were both in on some secret. "We have the resources, the love, and the home to give him everything he needs. A fresh start. A better life." But it wasn't about giving him a better life. It was about using him. Using him as a way to claim government subsidies for adopting a child from the system, padding their bank account with funds they didn't truly deserve. The boy had seen it before. Families who adopted for the money, for the tax benefits, who would then treat their new child as nothing more than a possession, something to show off to their friends and family. The court social worker, who had been quietly taking notes, looked uncertainly between the family and the boy. She had heard stories before, seen families come and go with the same practiced smiles, but something was off about this one. The boy's words, "They beat me," had struck a chord with her, but she was too afraid to speak up yet. She feared retribution from the system, a system that had failed so many children before. Still, she couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in the room. Mr. Gregory continued, "We have extensive experience with children," and his words were cut off by the boy, who, despite his fear, managed to speak again. "I don't want to be with them," the boy said softly but firmly, his voice trembling, yet strong with the conviction of someone who had seen enough. "They hurt me." Mrs. Gregory's smile tightened, and the flicker of annoyance in her eyes was brief but telling. She exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance with her husband, who quickly masked his frustration, but it was too late. The boy had seen it, felt it, the moment their mask had cracked. For a moment, the room stood still. The boy's words seemed to hang in the air, like a heavy weight. He had spoken the truth, a truth no one had expected, but a truth that was far too familiar to him. The judge, who had been quiet until now, sat back in his chair, his face a mask of professional composure. But inside, he was disturbed. Something about this family didn't sit right with him. He had seen cases like this before, families who wanted children for the wrong reasons, families whose motivations were rooted in greed and exploitation, not love. Mr. and Mrs. Gregory, the judge said, his voice steadied but laced with something colder now, your intentions will be thoroughly examined. The welfare of this child is the most important concern here. If there is any reason to believe you are not fit to adopt him, the court will take immediate action. Mrs. Gregory's smile wavered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she quickly regained her composure. Of course, Your Honor, she replied, but the boy saw the flicker of rage beneath her calm exterior. She wasn't used to being questioned, not by anyone. Certainly not by a child who was supposed to be in her care. The tension in the room continued to rise. The boy could feel it, the lie, the pretense, the coldness hiding behind their kindness. It wasn't love. It wasn't care. It was control. And as the court proceedings continued, it became more and more clear that the family's dark intentions couldn't remain hidden for long. They wanted him, but not for the reasons they claimed. They saw him as a way to benefit themselves, nothing more. The courtroom had grown quieter, the air thick with anticipation as the focus shifted from the adoptive family to the child who was at the center of it all. All eyes turned toward the boy, who had been sitting still in the witness box, his body slightly hunched, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The judge's gaze fell upon him first. He steadied the boy with an intensity that made the room seem even colder. His brow furrowed slightly, but the boy didn't look up. He was staring down at the floor, his small frame almost swallowed by the oversized suit he was wearing, ill-fitting, as if it were a costume he had been forced into for this moment. The boy was thin, his skin a deep shade of brown, his face a mixture of youth and a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. His hair was messy, like he had been running his hands through it anxiously, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. It was the look of a child who had been through too much already, who had seen too many things for someone so young, yet still managed to hold on to the smallest shred of hope that perhaps, just maybe, something good could come out of this. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the adoptive family across the room. His discomfort was palpable, his body language telling the story of a child who had learned to avoid certain people, people who had never truly seen him for who he was, but only as an object for their own gain. The adoptive family, smiling too widely, gazed at him with cold detachment. It was as though they had already decided he was theirs, to be molded, controlled, and displayed as their perfect child, all for the benefits they could reap. The boy's eyes were dark pools of vulnerability, a stark contrast to the clinical nature of the courtroom. There was an almost invisible tremor in his hands, though he tried to hide it, clenching them tightly. His lips were pressed together in a tight line, but it was clear he was trying to hold back tears, to keep the waves of emotion in check. As the judge's eyes moved from the boy to the adoptive parents, something seemed to shift. The tension in the room intensified. There was an unspoken understanding between the two. The adoptive parents, sitting with perfectly posed smiles, were hiding something darker, and the boy, though young, was far too aware of it. "Do you have any questions for the child?" the judge asked, breaking the silence with a voice that seemed both distant and filled with authority. The question hung in the air, but before anyone could speak, the boy's eyes flicked upward toward the judge. His gaze was direct, though it didn't hold the innocence one might expect from a child. It was sharp, almost accusatory, as though he could see right through the polished veneer of this process. The judge's gaze softened for a brief moment before he asked, "How do you feel about this family, name of the boy?" The boy's heart began to race, and his mind clouded with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. He had heard the words, heard them over and over again in every foster home, every family who had taken him in, only to discard him when it no longer suited them. Safety. Love. Family. The boy had learned the hollow nature of these promises too well. They didn't mean what they said. And this family, with their well-groomed smiles and rehearsed speeches, didn't mean it either. He glanced at the family again, his eyes briefly meeting the mother's. Her smile seemed to freeze for a split second, and he could feel the judgment seeping through the cold distance in her stare. He saw the way she was sizing him up, not as a child in need of care, but as something to be owned, to be controlled. The boy's heart sank. He had felt this before, this sense that he was nothing more than a tool, something that existed to serve a purpose for others, not something with his own dreams or needs. His life had been filled with one false promise after another, and now, as he sat there, he realized that this family wasn't different. They weren't any better. A wave of emotion surged within him, but he forced it down. He couldn't let them see his fear. He couldn't let them see how desperate he was. Instead, he fought to control his voice, his body, as he prepared to speak. His lips parted slightly as he finally spoke the words that had been trapped in his chest for so long. "I don't want to be with them." The room fell silent. The boy's words were simple, yet they held a weight that could not be ignored. He wasn't asking for pity, nor was he begging for attention. He was speaking the truth, the only truth that mattered in that moment. He didn't want to be with them. The adoptive mother's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Her eyes flashed with irritation, but she masked it with a tight-lipped smile. The adoptive father's expression hardened, though he quickly tried to reassert his composure. The boy had revealed the truth. He had seen them for what they truly were. And now, they knew they couldn't pretend any longer. The courtroom, once filled with silence, now seemed to buzz with an underlying tension. The boy, still sitting at the witness stand, felt his stomach churn as the adoptive parents exchanged uneasy glances. They had been smiling and nodding throughout the hearing, but now that the boy had spoken the truth, their carefully constructed facade of benevolent kindness was starting to crack. The adoptive father, Mr. Gregory, leaned forward slightly in his seat, his posture now straighter, as though he was trying to reclaim control of the situation. His voice was smooth and calculated, as if trying to calm the storm brewing in the room. "Your Honor," he began, "I understand that this is a sensitive matter, but we are fully prepared to give, name of the boy, the life he deserves. A safe and secure home, filled with all the comforts he could possibly need." The words sounded rehearsed, hollow. The boy could feel his heartbeat quicken as he heard them. He had heard those promises before, from foster parents, from other families who said the same things and never delivered. This wasn't about love, about care. This was about something darker, something the boy had come to understand all too well: exploitation. The adoptive mother, Mrs. Gregory, shifted in her seat, her expression faltering for just a moment before it hardened again. "We've worked hard to ensure that we're ready for this child," she added, her voice sweet but tinged with impatience. "We have a stable home and the resources to provide for him. He'll be well taken care of." The boy could see through their lies. He had been moved through so many homes, so many families that claimed to care, but their true intentions always emerged eventually. They didn't want him because they cared. They wanted him because he was a means to an end. He was a paycheck, a tool for them to claim government subsidies for adopting a child. A living, breathing object to be exploited. The boy had been in foster care long enough to know how this system worked. He had seen families who adopted children, not out of love, but for the financial incentives, for the money they could make off of a system that treated children like commodities. The money that would come from his adoption would fill their pockets, while he would remain nothing more than an object for them to control. He could feel the bitterness rising in his chest as he sat there, trying to make sense of the world around him. He wasn't a person to them. To them, he was a ticket to more money, more security. He was the key to unlocking a greater fortune. The judge, watching the adoptive parents with a raised brow, could sense something was amiss, though he had yet to fully grasp the extent of it. He knew they were pushing for the adoption, but the boy's words had unsettled him. The judge couldn't ignore the flicker of something darker in the way the parents spoke, the subtle way they treated the boy not as an individual but as an asset. "Your Honor," Mr. Gregory continued, his tone now more insistent, "we've been through the necessary steps. We've prepared our home, our finances, everything is in place to provide for him. We just want to give him the opportunities he deserves." But it was clear now. The boy wasn't just being given opportunities. He was being used. The glossy promises of love and stability, the pristine pictures of the perfect family, all masked the truth. The Gregorys wanted to profit from him. They had studied the system, learned how to manipulate it, and now they wanted to exploit this child, just as they had done with others before him. The boy's chest tightened as the adoptive parents continued speaking, but the words faded in his ears. All he could think about was how they would treat him once he was in their home. They would take everything from him, his dignity, his childhood, his safety, and sell him off for their own benefit. The social worker, sitting quietly beside the judge, shifted in her seat. She had seen cases like this before, families who were only in it for the money, the perks of adoption, the government benefits. But this case felt different. She could see the boy's distress, his fear, and the way he recoiled from the Gregorys. Something wasn't right. The boy didn't look at the adoptive parents anymore. His eyes were locked on the judge, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to see the truth. To see him as a human being, not a source of income. The boy had spent so much of his life being ignored, being treated as invisible, but now he wanted to be seen. He wanted someone to understand his pain, his fear, and the injustice that was about to be done to him. The room held its breath as the judge looked back at the boy, his expression softening for the first time since the hearing began. It was clear that the boy was more than just a case, more than just a child being moved from one home to another. He was a person, a child in desperate need of protection, not a tool to be used for profit. The tension in the courtroom was thick, as if the very air had become heavier with each passing second. The boy's heart was pounding, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His eyes flickered between the judge, who was seated high above them, and the adoptive family, whose cold smiles barely hid the greed beneath. The room seemed like a prison to him, the walls pressing in closer with every word spoken. He could feel their eyes on him, their expectations, their control over the situation. The judge, his face a mask of professionalism, glanced at the boy with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. His eyes, steady and calculating, looked down at the trembling child before him, as if trying to measure the boy's worth. He cleared his throat and asked, "How do you feel about this family adopting you?" It was a simple question, one that many children in the courtroom might have answered with joy, excitement, or even a nervous hope. But for this boy, those words were a trap. He had heard them before, spoken by social workers, foster parents, strangers who promised him safety and love, only to take it all away. This time, the question felt like 1,000 hands reaching into his chest, pulling at his heart, expecting him to offer up something he didn't have. The room fell quiet as the boy looked down at the floor. He couldn't find the right words. How could he explain to them what he had been through? How could he explain the fear, the years of pretending to be happy in homes that never felt like homes at all? He had learned the hard way not to trust the empty words of people who only saw him as a means to an end. The boy felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment, his vision blurred. He tried to push back the tears that threatened to spill, but the weight of it all, of being so small, so helpless, so alone, was too much. He had never really had the chance to speak up before. No one ever asked him what he wanted. No one had ever really listened. And now, here he was, expected to answer a question that felt like it would decide the rest of his life. Then, something inside him snapped. The anger, the fear, the frustration, it all came rushing to the surface. He couldn't keep pretending anymore. His voice, shaky but strong with the weight of truth, finally broke through the silence. "They beat me," the boy said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but it felt like a thunderclap in the room. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The boy's head was down, his eyes still locked on the floor, but his chest heaved with the effort of saying what he had kept hidden for so long. The silence that followed was deafening. The courtroom froze, as if time itself had paused in disbelief. The adoptive parents flinched, their masks of benevolence faltering for a fraction of a second. Mrs. Gregory's hand instinctively reached for her husband's arm, gripping it tightly, but the fear in her eyes was fleeting, only a split second before it was replaced with a look of anger that quickly masked any hint of vulnerability. The judge's face went pale. His hand hovered over his papers as he looked down at the boy, a mix of concern and shock crossing his features. The severity of the situation began to sink in. The social worker, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, felt her stomach drop. She had heard rumors, seen signs of abusive behavior in previous homes, but hearing the boy speak out so boldly, so directly, was a shock. This was no longer just an adoption hearing. It was something much darker, something far more urgent. The courtroom was still. For a long moment, no one spoke. The boy could hear his heart in his ears, pounding as he waited for a response that would determine everything. Would anyone believe him? Would anyone take his side, or would they just write him off, like so many others had done? Finally, the judge broke the silence, his voice no longer as authoritative as it had been when the hearing started. "Excuse me," he said, his words tinged with disbelief. Did you say that they beat you?" The boy nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak again. He didn't want to cry. He didn't want to show weakness. But the truth was, in this moment, he felt as vulnerable as he had ever been. He was afraid of what might happen next, afraid that his words wouldn't be enough to stop what was already in motion. The room remained tense as the judge quickly stood and motioned for the courtroom attendants. The seriousness of the situation was evident now. He was no longer just an impartial figure overseeing an adoption hearing. He was a man who realized the gravity of what had been revealed. The court proceedings shifted in an instant as the judge's attention turned entirely toward the boy's safety. The adoptive parents, however, sat frozen. Mrs. Gregory's face twisted in disbelief, but Mr. Gregory's anger was palpable now. He shot the boy a look of contempt, as if he had just been betrayed. It was clear that their carefully crafted persona had shattered, and beneath it, the truth was terrifying. "Your Honor, Mr. Gregory began, his voice sharp, but the judge held up his hand, cutting him off. "No," the judge said, his tone firm. "This court is adjourned. We are calling 911. Now." In that moment, the boy knew he had spoken the truth, but he also understood that this moment could change everything. It could expose the dark reality of the family that had come to take him, to use him, and it could finally bring justice to someone who had been voiceless for so long. The room was utterly silent. The echo of the boy's words, "They beat me," hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating cloud. Every eye in the courtroom was on him, and yet the boy felt as if he had become invisible. His body trembled, his chest tight with the weight of what he had just revealed. But he didn't dare look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, feeling the rush of emotions, the fear, the anger, and the pain, all mingling together, swirling within him. The judge, his face pale, stood frozen for a moment, his mouth slightly agape, unsure of how to proceed. For the first time since the hearing began, he appeared shaken, as if the boy's words had ripped through the veneer of professionalism and placed everyone in the room face to face with the horrifying truth. The adoptive parents, who had been so confident just moments earlier, now sat with their backs stiff, their smiles long gone. Mrs. Gregory's hands were clasped tightly together, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, but her eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed her true feelings. She didn't flinch when the boy spoke, but her glare was sharp enough to cut through glass. Her husband, Mr. Gregory, had his lips pressed into a thin line, his face reddening as he clenched his fists, his knuckles white. It was a look of barely contained fury, but it was also one of calculation, as though he were already figuring out how to turn this moment to his advantage. The social worker, seated at the back of the room, was visibly shaken. Her hand hovered near her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. She had seen cases of abuse before, but this, it felt different. This was a child whose truth was so raw, so unfiltered, that the room could barely absorb it. She could feel the weight of the situation, a situation that would no longer be just another case for paperwork. This was real. This was urgent. The tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. The air felt thick with disbelief, and yet there was no escaping the reality that had just been exposed. The boy's words had stripped away the polished facade of the Gregorys, revealing their true, malicious intentions. They hadn't come to adopt him because they wanted to provide him with love or care. No, they had come to take him in for a much darker purpose, to use him, to exploit him, and to profit from his pain. Mr. Gregory's voice broke the silence, rough and defensive, though there was an underlying panic in his tone. "Your Honor, this is preposterous," he sputtered, his hands raised in disbelief. "There must be some mistake. We would never." But the judge's gaze remained fixed on him, his expression hardening. He held up a hand to silence Mr. Gregory, his voice now firm, authoritative. "Enough," the judge said, his voice reverberating in the stillness. "Your actions will be investigated. This court will not stand for abuse of any kind. This child's safety is paramount." The boy could feel the tension tightening around him like a noose, but something inside him stirred, something small but powerful. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. The words he had spoken had caused a ripple, a crack in the system that had always failed him. Someone had heard him. Someone was taking him seriously. The adoptive mother, Mrs. Gregory, sat frozen, her face now a mask of barely contained rage. She leaned forward, whispering something to her husband, but the boy couldn't make out the words. He could feel the malice in her gaze, the coldness in her eyes. There was no love there, no compassion. Just control. The judge, after a long pause, turned to the social worker. "Call the authorities," he ordered, his voice cold and unwavering. "This child needs protection immediately. I will not allow him to return to an environment that could put him in harm's way." The social worker snapped to attention, quickly pulling out her phone and dialing the number for emergency services. As the phone rang, the boy's stomach twisted in knots. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this was the first step toward safety. And yet, a part of him was still terrified. Terrified of what the Gregorys might do once they had been exposed. They hadn't shown any remorse, no sign of regret for what they had done. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end of the line broke the tension, sending a shiver down the boy's spine. "I'm calling to report suspected child abuse," the social worker said, her voice clear and firm. "There's a child here in need of immediate protection. His safety is in danger." The boy could barely hear the rest of the conversation, but he didn't need to. He had done it. He had spoken out. His words had triggered a response. The truth was out there now, and there was no going back. But the fear remained. The courtroom was still, every single person in the room aware of the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The boy's life was now at the mercy of the justice system. Would it be enough to save him? Would they believe him, or would he continue to be passed from one set of hands to another, never finding peace? The seconds dragged on as the judge stood there, silent, his eyes never leaving the boy. The Gregorys sat rigidly, no longer speaking, no longer making eye contact. The social worker hung up the phone, and the air in the room grew thick with the weight of what was coming next. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of the boy's revelation. The words "they beat me" hung in the room, hanging over everyone like a cloud of dread. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. The judge, his face pale, sat frozen, eyes locked on the boy, as if struggling to process the gravity of what had just been said. The boy, still looking down at his lap, could feel the eyes of everyone on him, sharp, piercing, full of judgment. But he didn't dare look up. His words had shattered something in the room, and the fears that had been building inside him threatened to overwhelm him entirely. He could feel his heart racing, his breath shallow, his stomach twisted in knots. He had said it. He had spoken the truth. But now, what would happen? Would they believe him? Would anyone help him? The judge's expression shifted from one of shock to something colder, more focused. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his shaking hands, and then, with deliberate calm, turned to the social worker who had been observing from the side. "Call 911, the judge commanded, his voice firm and unyielding. "Now." The words were sharp, and they sent a jolt through the room. The social worker, her face pale, immediately sprang into action. She grabbed her phone with a swift motion, dialing the number with trembling fingers. Her mind raced as she spoke into the phone, trying to keep her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts that had overtaken her. 911, what is your emergency? The voice on the other end came through clearly, but to the social worker, it felt distant and unreal. "There is a child in immediate danger," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "He has been subjected to physical abuse. His adoptive family is attempting to take him, but it's clear he's in danger. We need immediate assistance to ensure his safety." The judge's eyes never left the boy, his expression one of growing concern and authority. He had seen many cases in his time, but this was different. This wasn't just about an adoption case, it was about a child's safety, about preventing further harm. The boy had spoken the truth, and now, the justice system was being forced to confront the ugly reality of the situation. Across the room, the adoptive parents remained silent, their faces hardening with each passing second. Mrs. Gregory's hands were now tightly folded in her lap, and the smile that had once been plastered on her face had long since disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. Mr. Gregory sat still, his jaw clenched tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the chair. Their calm composure was slipping away, revealing the rage beneath. The judge turned back to the adoptive family, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You will no longer be allowed to proceed with this adoption hearing. The child's safety is now the court's top priority. Your intentions will be investigated, and any actions against him will be fully examined." Mr. Gregory, unable to control himself any longer, stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous," he spat, his voice rising with anger. "We've done everything right. We followed the process. This child is just." "Sit down, Mr. Gregory," the judge interjected, his voice calm but authoritative, sending a clear message that there would be no tolerance for further disruption. "This hearing is over. Any further actions will be handled by the proper authorities." The judge's words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The room was charged with tension, every person waiting for the next steps. The boy's eyes remained fixed on the floor, his heart still pounding in his chest. He could hear the urgency in the social worker's voice as she relayed the details to 911. But despite the chaos, despite the fear, something inside him began to shift. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone believed him. Someone was finally taking him seriously. As the social worker hung up the phone, she looked at the judge, nodding as she relayed the news. "They're sending officers right now. The child will be protected." The judge gave a short nod. "Good," he said, his voice grim but resolute. "I expect a full investigation. And I expect this family to be held accountable for their actions." The adoptive parents, now standing together, exchanged a look. It was a silent exchange, but it spoke volumes. There was no apology, no shame in their eyes, just a cold, calculating anger, as if they were already considering their next move, the ways they could manipulate the situation to their benefit. The boy looked up for the first time since he had spoken. He met the judge's eyes, and for a brief moment, he saw something in them, something beyond the formality, beyond the judgment. There was empathy there. There was a flicker of hope. And in that moment, the boy knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable as the judge took a long pause. The air was thick with the weight of the boy's revelation and the gravity of the situation that was unfolding. The room, still filled with the echoes of the 911 call, seemed to hold its breath as everyone awaited the next steps. The boy had spoken the truth, and now it was time for everything else to be exposed, the family's lies, their motives, the systems that had allowed such exploitation to continue. The adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gregory, had gone from visibly tense to almost stone-faced. The coldness in their expressions was unsettling, but it was also telling. They no longer made eye contact with anyone in the room, instead focusing on each other with quick, furtive glances. The facade of loving, ideal parents they had so carefully constructed was starting to crumble before their very eyes. The polished smiles, the rehearsed lines, all of it, was just a mask hiding the true purpose behind their adoption request. The judge, standing from his seat, slowly walked over to the desk, collecting the papers in front of him, scanning through them with a steady hand. The room was silent, but there was a growing sense of realization. Everyone in that room now understood that the Gregorys weren't there out of love for the boy, but for something much more sinister. The social worker, whose heart had been racing ever since the boy spoke up, stood cautiously to the side, still unsure of what might happen next. She had seen the signs of manipulation before, but never so blatantly, never with such audacity. The boy's words had stripped the Gregorys of their charade, and now the truth was emerging. Mr. Gregory, unable to remain silent any longer, shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," he spat, his voice shaky with suppressed fury. "We've done everything the right way. We're qualified to take in a child, and we have the means to give him a life better than he could ever imagine. There's no reason for these accusations." His voice trembled with the effort to maintain control, but his words were thin, desperate. It was clear he was no longer speaking from a place of calm authority. His mask of the perfect father was slipping. The rawness of his anger revealed the truth that he had been trying to hide all along. He was not here to love or nurture this boy. He was here for one reason: to exploit the system, to take advantage of the government's adoption subsidies. Mrs. Gregory, who had been silently observing her husband's outburst, now spoke in a cold, clipped tone. "We wanted to give him a better life," she said, her eyes flicking between the judge and the boy. But there was no warmth in her voice, only the sharp edge of impatience. "We have the resources, the home, the stability. We could have given him everything he needed. He should be grateful." The boy, still sitting at the witness stand, could feel the anger bubbling within him, the injustice of her words stirring something deep inside him. Grateful? What could he possibly be grateful for? For being treated like property? For being taken in by a family who saw him only as a means to an end, a paycheck to pad their bank account? The judge, his face unreadable, turned back to the Gregorys, his eyes narrowing. "Your actions will be investigated," he said, his voice steady but laced with unmistakable authority. "And I will ensure that this court does everything in its power to uncover the full extent of your intentions." Mrs. Gregory's face paled slightly at the judge's words, but she quickly masked it, narrowing her eyes as she turned to face the boy. The mask was slipping, but she wasn't done yet. She needed to regain control. "You don't understand," she said with a chilling calmness, looking directly at the boy, her voice laced with venom. "We could have given you everything, everything you never had. But now you've ruined it. You've ruined everything by speaking out. You're nothing but a troublemaker." The boy recoiled at her words, his heart racing. He had heard this before, the blame shifted onto him. Always, he was the problem. But this time, it wouldn't work. He wasn't going to be silenced, not anymore. He had spoken the truth. He had revealed them for what they were. The judge's voice cut through the tension once again, his tone now unyielding. "This family will not be allowed to adopt this child, and I will personally ensure that an investigation is opened into their activities. The system exists to protect children like, name of the boy, not exploit them for gain." Mrs. Gregory's lips twisted into a tight, disdainful smile, but it was clear that the fight was slipping away from her. The court had seen through their motives, and no amount of manipulation or false compassion could cover the truth. The boy was not their possession to control. He was a child, and he deserved more than they could ever offer him. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, but something in him shifted. He wasn't powerless anymore. For the first time, he could see the possibility of a life where he was treated with the respect and care he deserved, not as a commodity, not as a tool to be used. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, he knew this moment when the truth had been revealed, was the beginning of something new. The room had barely settled when the door to the courtroom opened once more. The sound of the door hinges creaking echoed in the stillness, and in walked two officers, their uniforms sharp, their faces unreadable. The presence of law enforcement was a sharp reminder of the severity of the situation that had unfolded. The boy's words, his simple but gut-wrenching revelation, had set everything in motion, but now it was time for the truth to be fully uncovered. The social worker, who had been standing by the judge's side, stepped forward, handing over a stack of files. She had been gathering information on the Gregorys, collecting reports from previous cases, and it was clear now that the adoptive family's dark secrets were about to be exposed. The truth was not just about this particular boy, it was about a pattern of cruelty, abuse, and manipulation. The adoptive parents had a history, one that had been hidden by their carefully constructed public persona. But today, it was all coming to light. The judge took the files from the social worker, flipping through the papers with a steady hand. His brow furrowed as he scanned the documents, his expression darkening with each passing page. The evidence was overwhelming: reports of neglect, statements from children previously in their care, and confidential files detailing complaints about the Gregorys' treatment of foster children. These reports, the judge began, his voice tight with disgust, confirm what the boy has said. The Gregorys have a history of mistreatment and exploitation. They have been investigated before, yet managed to slip through the cracks of the system. Mrs. Gregory's face, which had remained cold and composed up until this point, finally betrayed a flicker of fear. Her hands shook slightly in her lap, though she still managed to maintain a composed, almost defensive posture. Her husband, Mr. Gregory, on the other hand, had grown visibly pale. His hands, once clenched in frustration, now hung limply by his sides. There was no longer any pretense of innocence, no more rehearsed speeches. The truth was out. The judge continued, his voice becoming colder with every word. According to these documents, you've adopted children in the past with the intent to profit from their government benefits. The children who have been placed with you have reported physical and emotional abuse, and there are enough witnesses to corroborate these claims. Mr. Gregory shot up from his seat, his face contorted in a mix of anger and panic. "That's a lie," he shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. "We never—" "Sit down, Mr. Gregory," the judge interjected sharply, his voice authoritative and unwavering. "This is not up for debate. The evidence speaks for itself." Mr. Gregory froze, his mouth snapping shut, and he slowly sank back into his seat. His shoulders were slumped now, the defiance in his posture replaced by something darker, regret, fear, and perhaps, for the first time, the realization that he had been caught. The social worker, visibly shaken but resolute, stepped forward again. "I have spoken with former foster children under the Gregory's care," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "There have been reports of physical abuse, neglect, and emotional cruelty. These children were subjected to harsh punishments, were denied basic needs, and were used to claim government subsidies. This family does not have the capacity to care for a child, let alone provide a safe and nurturing home." Mrs. Gregory opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The social worker's words had struck a nerve. There was no defense left to offer, no lies to spin. The truth was too loud, too undeniable. The boy, still sitting at the witness stand, could feel the weight of the moment. His heart was still racing, but now there was something else, something he hadn't felt before. Relief. The truth was being confirmed, and it wasn't just his word against theirs. It wasn't just a child's claim. The evidence, the testimony, the history, it all pointed to the same thing: the Gregorys were not fit to adopt anyone, least of all him. The courtroom was now buzzing with the weight of the truth that had been hidden for so long. People exchanged glances, murmured among themselves, but the boy felt none of it. He didn't care about the whispers. He didn't care about what came next. What mattered now was that he was being heard. He had spoken, and the world was listening. The officers who had entered the room earlier now moved toward the Gregorys. One of the officers, a tall woman with dark hair, looked at them both with a cold, professional gaze. "Mr. and Mrs. Gregory, you are under investigation for child abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We're placing you under temporary custody while we further investigate these allegations. You have the right to remain silent." The Gregorys didn't fight back, but their eyes darted around the room, their once confident demeanor now shattered. Mr. Gregory's lips trembled, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and rage as the officers moved in to arrest him. Mrs. Gregory remained silent, her eyes locked on the boy for one last, fleeting moment. There was no apology in her gaze, no remorse. There was only a cold, calculated fury, as if the realization that their plans had been undone was too much for her to bear. The officers led them out of the courtroom in silence, and the room seemed to exhale in unison, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The boy, still seated in the witness stand, felt the tightness in his chest slowly loosen. He wasn't free yet. There was still so much to face, so much to navigate, but for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of the world shift in his favor. The courtroom was still, the heavy air thick with tension as the Gregorys were led out of the room by the officers. Their smug demeanor had been replaced by one of fear and confusion, their carefully crafted mask of ideal parents utterly shattered. For a brief moment, the boy allowed himself to breathe a little easier, but there was still so much uncertainty ahead. The judge had ordered their immediate investigation, but the road to safety was long and fraught with obstacles. The boy shifted nervously in the witness stand, still feeling the sting of the attention he had drawn, yet knowing that in this moment he had gained something crucial: his voice. He had spoken out. He had exposed the truth, and now, at least for the time being, he wasn't alone. There were people who cared, people who were ready to fight for him. The judge, who had been quiet since the arrest of the Gregorys, turned his gaze back to the boy. The stern, authoritative expression on his face had softened, and there was a hint of understanding in his eyes as he looked down at the young boy who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. "Are you okay?" the judge asked gently, his voice no longer the hard, unfeeling tone of someone simply doing their job, but the compassionate tone of a man who had finally understood the depth of the child's suffering. The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding. His lips trembled, and he forced himself to keep his head up. "I'm okay," he told himself, even though the words didn't feel entirely true. But he wasn't just a scared, helpless child from before. He had spoken out, and for the first time in a long while, he felt as though someone was finally paying attention. The social worker, who had been standing at the back of the room, stepped forward cautiously. Her expression was one of quiet relief, but there was still a somber understanding in her eyes. She had been the one to call 911, the one to help take the first step in protecting the boy. She approached the judge and the boy, her voice soft but resolute. "Your Honor," she said, "I've been in contact with a safe home that specializes in emergency placement for children who are in immediate danger. It's a place with a proven track record of ensuring that children are not only protected but given the support they need to recover from traumatic experiences." The boy's eyes flickered toward her, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something, a place where he could finally feel safe, away from the abuse, away from the people who had tried to control him. The judge nodded, his expression serious. "I believe that is the best course of action for the child," he said. "I'm authorizing the immediate placement of, name of the boy, in that facility. He will be placed under the care of professionals who can help him, and I'll ensure that every necessary step is taken to provide for his future." The boy felt a weight lifting off of his shoulders. He wasn't going to be passed from one foster family to another, thrown into another situation where he was at the mercy of strangers. For the first time in his life, he wasn't going to be treated like an object or an inconvenience. As the social worker spoke with the judge, arrangements were being made for the boy's transfer to a place where he could heal. The boy was still processing everything, still reeling from the whirlwind of emotions that had swept through him in the past hours. But amid the chaos, there was a quiet sense of relief. His truth had been heard. He was going to be safe. "Do you understand what's happening now?" the judge asked him gently. The boy nodded slowly, swallowing hard. He was scared, terrified even, but he wasn't alone anymore. There were people who cared, people who were fighting for him. I don't want to go back," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper, but his words carrying the weight of everything he had endured. "I don't want to be with them anymore." The judge's eyes softened, and he gave the boy a reassuring nod. "You won't be. I promise you that. We're going to make sure you're safe, that you get the care and love you deserve." As the social worker made the final arrangements, she approached the boy and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. "You did great today," she said, her voice full of kindness. "You told the truth, and that took a lot of courage. You're going to be okay." The boy's eyes met hers, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he would be okay. He had spent so much of his life being hurt, being unseen, but now, in this moment, he felt like he could finally begin to heal. The courtroom, once filled with tension, was now quiet, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. But as the boy was led out of the room to safety, there was a new kind of hope settling in his chest. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it was his to walk. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a survivor. The courthouse was still buzzing with quiet conversations as the boy was escorted out, his small frame enveloped by the social worker's warm presence. The events of the day had unfolded in ways that no one could have predicted, and as the adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gregory, were led away in handcuffs, the full weight of their actions began to set in. Their smug, polished personas were shattered. No longer could they hide behind the image of the perfect adoptive parents. The truth had come to light, and now they would face the consequences of their cruelty and exploitation. As the officers escorted the Gregorys to the holding room, the courtroom remained eerily quiet, the aftermath of their arrest still hanging in the air. The judge sat back at his desk, his eyes scanning the papers once again, the gravity of the situation pressing on him. He had seen many cases in his career, but nothing had prepared him for the depths of manipulation and abuse that the Gregorys had been involved in. "Mr. and Mrs. Gregory," the judge said, his voice firm as he looked down at the case files before him. "You will be facing charges of child abuse, neglect, and exploitation. The full extent of your actions will be investigated, and you will be held accountable for the suffering you've caused. Mr. Gregory, still flustered and angry, stood defiantly. "This is all a mistake," he spat, his voice hoarse with frustration. "You have no idea what you're doing. We were trying to give him a better life, and now you're ruining it. You're destroying everything." His outburst echoed through the courtroom, but it only seemed to make matters worse. The judge raised a hand to silence him, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "You made a choice," the judge replied coldly. "A choice to exploit a child for your own financial gain. A choice to manipulate the system, to pretend to be what you were not. And now, you will pay the price for that choice. The system is meant to protect children like, name of the boy, not allow them to be taken advantage of." The judge turned to the prosecutor, signaling that the paperwork to charge the Gregorys with the appropriate offenses should be finalized immediately. The prosecution team, which had been quietly gathering evidence, moved with swift efficiency to ensure that the couple would not escape the full extent of the law. The court had been the first step, but the real work of holding the Gregorys accountable had only just begun. As the officers led the Gregorys out of the courtroom, their expressions hardening with every step, the courtroom remained filled with a heavy silence. The audience that had gathered to witness the hearing was stunned. Some exchanged hushed words, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the gravity of the situation. The boy's courage had uncovered a dark truth, and now there was no denying what had transpired. Outside the courtroom, media outlets were already gathering, cameras flashing as they sought to capture the fallout from the shocking events. The Gregorys had been well known in the local community for their apparent wealth, their image as philanthropists, their carefully constructed facade of loving, generous parents. But now the truth was out. And the world was watching. The consequences of the Gregorys' actions would ripple far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Their reputation, built on lies and exploitation, would be torn apart. The investigation into their past cases would likely uncover more of their manipulative schemes, not just with the boy, but with other children they had taken in over the years. Their financial records would be scrutinized, revealing the depths of their exploitation. But for the boy, the consequences were different. The punishment they faced would not undo the pain he had endured, but it would ensure that no other child would fall prey to them. He had done something that many children before him had not been able to do. He had fought back, he had spoken out, and he had exposed their cruelty for the world to see. The boy sat in the safe house that night, his body exhausted but his spirit a little stronger than before. The process had been overwhelming, the emotions raw and tumultuous, but he had found strength in the truth. He was no longer just a victim, he was a survivor. And for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The Gregorys' actions had finally caught up with them, and they would face the full weight of the law. Their cruelty, their exploitation, would no longer be hidden behind their polished smile. They would be held accountable for the child they had tried to break, for the lives they had destroyed. But as the boy sat quietly in his new, safe room, surrounded by people who cared, he understood something important. The road to healing wouldn't be easy, but it was his road now. He had the power to shape his future, to find his own place in the world, free from fear and manipulation. The Gregorys had been punished, but the boy's journey was just beginning. And this time, he would be protected. The courtroom had finally returned to a sense of order, the chaos of the previous hours slowly giving way to a somber quiet. The boy, now seated in the safe house, had been informed that the Gregorys had been arrested and charged with child abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Their lives, built on deception and manipulation, were now in shambles. But for the boy, this was just the beginning of a new chapter. It had been a few days since the hearing, and though the boy was no longer in immediate danger, the emotional weight of the events was still fresh. He hadn't fully processed everything, his past, the Gregorys' cruel intentions, and the unexpected turn of events, but one thing was clear, he was no longer alone. He was safe. And for the first time in his life, he could start to think about his future. The judge, having ordered a thorough investigation and immediate placement in a safe facility, had made the necessary arrangements for the boy to be transferred to a permanent home. As much as the boy feared the unknown, there was a sense of calm that came with the certainty of his safety. No longer would he have to hide his true feelings, pretend to be happy, or endure the manipulation of those who had no interest in his well-being. Now, he could begin to heal. The final hearing, just a week after the dramatic court session, was set to take place. The judge sat in his chambers, the decision before him clear but still not without weight. He had seen countless cases in his career, but there was something about this one, something about the boy's courage, that stayed with him. The truth had been spoken, and justice had been served. But what mattered now was ensuring that the boy would never again face the same abuse and exploitation. The courtroom was packed once more as the final decision was read aloud. The Grigorys, who had hoped to regain control of the situation, were no longer present. Their rights to adopt had been completely revoked, and they would face trial for their actions. They had been exposed for who they truly were: selfish, manipulative, and cruel. The boy's words had been the catalyst for their downfall, and now the law would make sure they paid the price. The judge stood, his voice firm and clear as he addressed the room. This court has determined that name of the boy will be placed in the care of a family who can provide him with the love, stability, and respect he deserves. The events of the past week have proven that his safety and well-being are of the utmost importance, and I believe that this decision will provide him with the chance to grow and thrive in an environment where he can finally be a child. The boy sat quietly in the back of the room, the words a small but powerful comfort. He couldn't hear the crowd or feel the weight of their stares. What mattered now was that he wasn't going to be a victim anymore. He wasn't going to be exploited. He was going to be free. The judge turned to the social worker, who had been at the center of the boy's care since the moment he was taken from the Grigorys. Please make sure that name of the boy is placed in a home that can offer him the support he needs to heal. This child has endured more than anyone should have to. He deserves a future where he can be happy and safe. The social worker nodded, her expression softening. She had seen the boy's resilience, his determination, and his quiet strength, and she knew that he was capable of finding his place in the world. But it would take time. Healing wouldn't happen overnight. The courtroom filed out slowly, the crowd dispersing into the corridors, leaving behind only the boy and the people who had fought for him. The decision had been made, but now it was time for the real work to begin. Time to ensure that the boy would not just survive, but thrive. The boy was taken to his new home, a place far removed from the darkness he had left behind. It was a home filled with warmth and kindness, where the people who lived there treated him not as a burden, not as something to be controlled or used, but as a person with his own hopes and dreams. He was given the space to be himself, to explore the things he had been denied for so long. There were no more lies, no more pretending. For the first time, the boy began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved happiness. In the weeks that followed, the boy's life began to change in small but significant ways. He went to school with a new sense of confidence, though there were still moments of fear, moments when he had to remind himself that he was safe, that he no longer had to run from his past. He began to trust again, to open up to the people around him, slowly letting them see the real him. He still remembered the courtroom, the moment he spoke the truth, and the weight of the judge's words. But he also began to remember the feeling of being truly cared for, the feeling of waking up in a home that wasn't a trap, that wasn't a facade. The boy's future was no longer uncertain. For the first time, he had a chance to build something real, something lasting. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a child, free to grow, free to dream. And as the months passed, the boy realized something incredible: he had the power to shape his own life. He had been given a second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away.